Thank you.
All right, we'll get started. Thank you for everyone who is joining us today. I know it's election night and it rained, and all of which, and maybe the rain more than anything, can be a real challenge. But we're delighted to have you here with us tonight for the second lecture in our loose series on religion and health for this academic year. Before we begin, I want to thank everyone at the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion, especially Patty and Bex, for helping make events happen, and the Luce Foundation for funding this, as well as some funding from the Othering and Belonging Institute. And with that, I'm delighted to welcome Scheper Hughes for a talk tonight on medicine as sacrament. When I was putting together the programming for this year, it was hard not to be thinking about epidemics, let's put it that way, and pandemics. But I also wanted to make sure it wasn't the historian me just about the present. So I was really excited to really find Scheper and her work. She joins us here from UC Riverside, where she's a professor of history. And her work focuses on Latin American and Latinx religions, with particular consideration for the spiritual lives of Mexican and Mexican-American Catholics. Her book, The Church of the Dead, The Epidemic of 1576 and the Birth of Christianity in the Americas, NYU 2021, so recent for everyone looking for a new book, considers a crisis in the church that resulted from a catastrophic epidemic that took 2 million lives. In the aftermath, Spanish missionaries and Indigenous Catholics articulated rival visions for the future of Christianity. And I am really excited to learn more because I teach a tiny little bit about religion in what for me as a modern U.S. historian is very early Americas, so it's always exciting to get new perspectives, and in particular to be thinking about it through the lens of health, because I find that to be very exciting for students. So with that, I want to welcome Professor Hughes, and I think we're all going to learn a lot from her tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jen. Thank you. It's really great to be here on this rainy election night, and hopefully this will provide a little bit of distraction, right, as we wait for those results to come in. So I'm really thankful to the center for the invitation to be here, and I am going to be talking from this new book project, and but sort of focused on this idea, I think, or orienting it around this idea of health as the Luce series kind of invokes. So thinking and considering the relationship between religion and health as refracted through the pandemic past. And the epidemics that I work on are the 16th century Mexican epidemics in particular, and I am interested specifically in how Catholics, both Spanish and native, Spanish and indigenous, imagined for themselves, each of them, a collective future in the aftermath of these sort of waves of epidemic in the 16th century, and after one in particular. So I want to talk about that one in particular. I came to this topic as I was finishing my first book, which was a biography of a Mexican crucifix, thinking about religious devotion in Mexico over 400, 500 years. And as I was concluding that book, I was trying to understand how epidemic cataclysm in Mexico had shaped some of the, or provided a context for some of the devotional practices that I was reflecting on. And I found that the literature that I was looking for just really wasn't there, which is always that starting place of a project, right? You're like, I'm trying to understand this thing because we know that these epidemics were definitive, right? And that experience of demographic catastrophe had to be the primary frame, and yet I didn't think we really understood how that was shaping religious experience or religious self-understandings in this key period, right, when people in Mexico are coming to understand themselves as Catholic, to understand themselves as Christians. So 10 years ago, that was the beginning of this project, and when I was, when I had began working on it in archives, primarily in Seville in Spain, I couldn't possibly have imagined that it would come out in the midst of a global pandemic. And of course I wrote my editor and I was like, what am I supposed to do? She goes, just finish the book. Don't go and rewrite the book, right? And so
Second edition.
yeah, that's the next, that'll be the next one. But there were some things that were made clear to me, interesting, like that sense of surges in the pandemic, like that, living through that, that helped me understand something about how over sort of this 3, 4, 5-year period, this one particular pandemic was sort of ebbing and flowing, and how that kind of pulsation, right, of a pandemic shapes and defines reality, like a moment to breathe and then that retreat again, right? So this book, The Church of the Dead, is telling kind of a larger story, right, about how the Mexican church, which I think is arguably the first and oldest Christian institution in the hemisphere, how that came into being in the context of catastrophic mortality and epidemic disease wrought by colonial rule. So I was kind of driven into the archives by questions that actually emerged toward the end of my first book in the ethnographic present, seeking to kind of retrieve a usable past, right? One that confronts, on the one hand, the catastrophe of European invasion, but at the same time offers a story of origin worthy of the Catholic faith of millions of people in Mexico today, right? So in a way, what I offer here is a counter-history, a possible counter-history of Christianity and of Catholic origins hemispherically, right? And in the process, I worked to dislodge some of the most entrenched myths of American religious history, and these have been contested periodically, but they kind of linger and persist, and that is that Europeans were the primary agents of Christianization in the Americas, that conversion necessarily signaled conquest, subjugation, and defeat, and that Christianity was the inevitable outcome of European colonial rule. If anything, I think in my studies I came to understand that epidemic cataclysm wrought by Spanish invasion reveals that the project of Christianization was always contingent and always precarious and never inevitable. So those are the sort of broad brushstrokes of the argument. But today in particular, I want to follow the archival and documentary historical record in the aftermath of this particular epidemic in the last quarter of the 16th century. And it's an epidemic of Cocolitzli. I'll talk a little bit about that. But in this aftermath emerged two contrasting visions for recovery and repair, we could say for health, right? That's the theme of the series. But two contrasting visions of recovery and repair, each cast in corporeal and collective terms, one Spanish and one Indigenous, one Mexican, and of course I'm drawing these starkly for the sake of a kind of provocation, right? I'm drawing those fairly starkly. So one Spanish, one Indigenous, one wounded, and the other whole, but both fundamentally Catholic in their ethos and in their framing. So the mortandad is the word that emerged very strongly in the documentary record, as I'll cite from some of these sources, my primary body is about 135 manuscript letters sent from Mexico by church personnel, we could say, right? By priests, friars, bishops, Spanish religious, during the time of the epidemic, this sort of particular epidemic I'm looking at, which is the kind of third and final major epidemic of the 16th century. And there are many, right, depending on how epidemiologists and demographers kind of categorize them, that kind of punctuate the 16th century. And so there are three here, 1520, 1545, and the one that I'm focused on especially is 1576, right? And you can see the kind of demographic decline as it comes finally toward, plummets toward its nadir, right? So the actual lowest point of the indigenous population was closer to 1620, but this final epidemic kind of driving it toward that point. And of course we know that that population, the native population of Mexico, begins to recover at that point quite dramatically, right? So, and throughout the 17th century. So, but in broad brushstrokes, before Spanish invasion, the population of Mexico was 22 million, more or less. There's arguments there. But by the end of the century, it was no more than 2. And so I'm working with both the Spanish sources that are written during the time of the pandemic, but then also working with native histories, historical chronicles, and also maps. And so toward the end of what I talk about today, I want to think about one of these maps in particular. So one of the ways that I begin the book is to think about the way that the demographic, the scope of the cataclysm of the 16th century is sort of legible geologically, right? So the so-called Orbis spike refers to a measurable drop in carbon dioxide levels recorded in the Antarctic glacial ice core, and reflecting this precise period of population decline. And so this boundary marker between geological epochs, and in this marker, some scientists have read this sort of this mortality crisis. So in a sense, we can understand that this human tragedy in its scale is written on geological landscapes and captured in ice and earth. So in some sense, I think we can think about this particular epidemic, this particular period, as a kind of religion at the dawn of the Anthropocene. Sometimes I've thought about it in those terms. So the particular epidemic that I focus on in this book, at first I thought I might do them all, but then you get to the archive and you're like, okay, this one, I knew I was going to start with this one, and I just couldn't get past it because I found the material so complicated and so rich that it took me that time to kind of, years to kind of figure out an interpretive framework that could really be responsive to that complexity. And so the epidemic of Cocolitzli is, debated. It's been debated over centuries, really, what it is, and kind of most recently hemorrhagic fever. But the word Cocolitzli is a Nahuatl word that was kind of innovated to name this particular illness that wasn't recognizable immediately, either to Spanish observers or to the native communities that suffered it. And so one of the sources, this codex, a chronicle from the early 17th century, reflects on this particular illness, and the entry for this period, this year, says in August of 1576, Cocolitzli spread, blood emerged from our noses, only in our homes priests heard us confess as they favored us with food, doctors cured us, then the bells were abandoned and no longer rung, people were buried alone, the one holy church left us. So in these lines, and I have very little Nahuatl, so I rely on collaborators that I work with to try to draw out various possible meanings and interpretations. And then, of course, in the margin there, you see the pictorial kind of illustration of these events, and it goes on to speak about a religious procession. So you have that sense of causality of the person suffering from the particular ailment, and then that triggers a procession, right? And and a penitential procession, right? So the blood also on the vestments of the friar who's processing, and I'm not sure what's going on with the sunglasses there. Yeah. Sort of puzzled over that, sort of what the eyes and how those, what those signify. But I've thought a bit about this particular entry and all that's narrated there, right? So this sacramental intervention, right, with confession, this sort of provisioning and care of food, this sense of being cured, and then that sense of being abandoned, right? And Sahagun's Historia General also reiterates this, the Spanish Franciscan who says, you know, that while the missionary friars for the first few months were very involved and in people's homes and taking care of them and trying to kind of mitigate it, he says after about 2 months, they kind of gave up, right? They're sort of overwhelmed by the scope and scale. So this history also reiterated in Spanish accounts. Let's see here. From this 16th century mortandad, right, and that idea of a kind of death event that punctuates the century, emerges what I've termed the Ecclesia ex mortuis, this church of the dead, church from the dead, and I wield that term as a kind of theological category that has within it a kind of critique, right? That this is an institution, an ecclesial institution that's shaped and defined in relation to these structures of violence and death. And I think sometimes about this Ecclesia ex mortuis, this church of the dead, as the kind of settler church, right? The colonial church, the church that is constructed really, or constructs its sovereignty upon a condition of death. And so I kind of trace that through the documents. And so there's a way in which here I kind of leverage some of my theological training, right, to see this project as a work of theological forensics, right, in that it excavates the many religious ideas that were fomented and circulated in the colonial cataclysm. And for me, these theological ideas that emerge from the documents, then I kind of hone them into critical analytics for thinking about the colonial period and to kind of sharpen both our understanding of the ideas that circulated and then also to interrogate those ideas. With respect to this idea of theological forensics, I think my methods are historical and they're archival, but I also analyze these manuscripts, these historical materials, both Spanish and Indigenous, in a theological register that I think is not particularly common among historians of colonial Latin America. So, these texts, I search them for I engage in a penetrating search for meaning, right? These are densely layered kind of Christian texts and sources that have these layered meanings that have accrued, theological meanings that have accrued over time. In fact, I think of them as testaments, these sources that are produced in the context of this epidemic crisis, possessing a kind of excess of meaning, excess of Christian meaning. Symbolic religious values that I kind of try to uncover and discover through close, almost exegetical reading of the archive. I think about theologies as root attachments. Within them are identified the origins of affective attachment to social, political, and territorial settlements. To be clear, my attentions rest not on formal systematic theologies, those that are sanctioned vetted by the magisterium, but rather vernacular, lived theologies, those that, quote, infuse everyday life, emergent with long histories of the body, flesh, affects, and material religion, unquote. And that's the wonderful Valentina Napolitano, who's at University of Toronto. And really one of the kind of powerful thinkers in this vein of critical Catholic studies. So in this work of theological forensics, I unearthed the Catholic theology of the corpus mysticum, of the sacred, mystical, corporate, collective body, to see how this core idea is transformed in the context of the global imperial church, and then again at the hands of Indigenous Catholic survivors of the Mortandad. So I'll start then kind of looking with that critical apparatus, that critical framework, looking more closely at Spanish theological ideas, their ways of categorizing, understanding, and interpreting this particular epidemic and how it impinges upon and impacts the future that they imagine for themselves. And so one of the things that I think is, and here's Jesus, the apothecary. Yeah, it's like mixing his little. One of the things that I observed, and this is not fully tested hypothesis, but a sort of observation that that was emerging for me in this research, is that there's a way in which the colonial church kind of reasserts, the religious orders kind of reassert themselves in the context of this cataclysm in the 16th century as being on the medical front lines, right? So they are priests and members of religious orders kind of are reoccupying this essential and powerful social role as healers and physicians. And so my sense is that in Europe, the medical establishment was being increasingly regulated in the centuries before Europeans are arriving in Mexico. And their kind of their role as doctors, we could say, surgeons, bloodletters, all of that is sort of now increasingly regulated. So they've lost a certain part of their status, right? Their power, their social power, their capital within European society. Then they come to Mexico and they kind of go large, right? They really kind of inhabit that role. Both hospitals in the 16th century in Mexico are established by all kinds of institutions and structures, including Hernan Cortez, right, who's the founder of the first hospital in Mexico. And many of these, at least 200 by the end of that century, are clinics. We say hospital, but a range of clinics and shelters and places where people were receiving care. About 200 of them by the end of the 16th century. So they kind of occupy this space, they reoccupy the space as part of their disproportionate influence in colonial society, right? So during the Cocolitzli pandemic, the religious orders fashioned themselves as hospitaleros, first responders on epidemic front lines. So here in this image, this is Jose Clemente Orozco, probably my favorite of the Mexican muralists, is, in this self-imagining and confronting the epidemic cataclysm. He's now a healer, a surgeon, a medic, a nurse, ministering expertly to the bodies of the ill, offering an incanted solemn prayer, extending a gentle hand to feed the sick when they're too weak to eat by themselves, but also just as likely to administer a soothing syrup, to prescribe a medicinal tea, and even to wield a whetted blade when bloodletting was deemed necessary. So Spanish missionaries imagined themselves as parents, protectors, and physicians. They viewed the Indios, and that's a term that I decide that I kind of use advisedly in this work, but viewed them simultaneously as vulnerable children and dying patients dependent on them for protection and medical care. This relationship absorbed indigenous Mexican Catholics into a Spanish emotional world in which the mortandad was made comprehensible by way of an effective logic. Because in their own self-perception, missionaries were left to confront the ravages of colonization while charged with the impossible task of mitigating the mortandad. So that's their self-understanding. And this lithograph by Orozco, I think, is powerful in its ambiguity, right? So is this friar is he a caretaker or is he threatening, right? Like, and that's very much in keeping with Orozco's work, that sort of ambiguity. But in the mortandad, healing care functioned as a religious rite. It was a kind of sacrament for Spanish missionaries in their capacity to transform the indigenous lives, the lives of their indigenous patients, more fully into Christians, right? Their bodies more fully into Christian flesh, not marking them as other, but absorbing them as proximate, same, and familiar. And again, as Valentina Napolitano puts it, the project of Roman Catholic conversion was that of the transformation of otherness into sameness. So performed alongside more traditional sacraments, these curative interventions deployed in Cocoliztli sutured bodies together, weaving ritualized and effective bonds between Spanish bodies and the bodies of the Indios, so that they were understood to be of one flesh, belonging to one body. And serving also to bring these colonial subjects more fully under the jurisdiction of the church, whether in life or in death. In the book, I spend a fair amount of time developing this idea of the colony as mystical body of Christ, right? So this theology that I saw in the Spanish sources, right, where they were imagining the colony as a territorial, as a territorial fiction, right, as superinscribed with the mystical body of Christ as a Catholic theological concept. So the Catholic evangelization of New Spain necessitated the incorporation of new persons into the body of the church, and so these Catholics then also needed to be incorporated as part of the mystical body of Christ. But the challenge theologically for these writers is that the mortandad was kind of ravaging this colonial corporate body just as it was emerging into being. So during Cocoliztli, in this correspondence, in these letters, this new world body of Christ was put in jeopardy, right? It was a wounded body. And anxiety and apprehension and a range of emotions by these missionaries about that woundedness and the fragility of that body, and within that, indigenous Christians appearing as the feet of the body of Christ, right? The wounded feet. And so I'll read this one, just to give you a sense of some of these letters. This was the Bishop of Michoacan, Medina Rincon, who I found to be a kind of, he wrote many, many, many letters of protest in the midst of this epidemic. And he writes in one of them, he's writing to the king, right? And what he wants is to be released. He basically is saying in these letters after letters, and there were many bishops, I think it was the Bishop of Puebla, he just went back to Spain and he was like, I'm out, I'm not, So, but this bishop, what he wants is to be released. And the sort of sum total of his letters is, look, I've been telling you for years what a disaster this is. And no one's listening to me. And I've said, you need to take these steps to kind of protect people from these extractive systems, and he doesn't use that language, but from these sort of exploitative practices, and people are being mistreated. And finally he says, if you're not going to listen to me, just send me home, because there's nothing more I can do here, right? So he's kind of an interesting voice, right? So he writes, this land is being destroyed and lost so that it seems that the predictions and conjectures made by some that the Indios will surely reach their end are coming to fruition. With great haste, the Indios travel toward their end because in all parts and regions, many are falling ill, and many more are dying from the slow and deadly pestilence that never ceases. The natives have always been the feet of this body, but although the head that governs sees their fragility and weakness, it nevertheless continues to walk around on them, the feet, and they get worse and weaker. The Indios are exploited for agricultural labors, for the construction of buildings, for work in mines. They say that these things are necessary for the Republic, that the Indios will last as long as they will last, as a spoon made of bread. So Medina's theological imagery describes an injured mystical body rendered into parts, a shared body divided against itself, and a broken body equated with bread. Under Spanish invasion and imperial rule, the corpus mysticum provided a potent ordering narrative that was adapted to explain and interpret the place of indigenous Christian subjects, both within the expanding body of the Church Universal and within the structures of colonial society. So the mystical body of Christ was reimagined and remade in response to the spiritual and political demands of the emerging global and imperial church. Through the idea of corpus mysticum, the Spanish religious in Mexico came to regard in theological terms the bodies of the Indios, their flesh, as an extension of their own, and perhaps more powerfully of Christ's. In the theological imaginary of the Spanish, the colony became a fleshy thing. And Bartolomé de las Casas writes, also using this imagery, perhaps the world could be cured with the application of medicine to the wounds that the human lineage of these parts in Mexico has received. Perhaps then all of the mystical body that pertains to our part by chance would be healed. So he also, Bartolomé de las Casas also uses that language of a corporate wounded body that is in need of healing. So I want to say now shift to indigenous sources and native sources. And this is sort of a kind of dramatic shift, a hard shift, turning from the perspective of these Spanish observers and witnesses to that of the surviving communities themselves, the pueblos de Indios themselves. In the aftermath of Cocolitzli, pueblos de Indios struggled against ruin, decline, and disrepair. And I want to say that by the time of the Cocolitzli pandemic, 50 years, you could say, right, after the symbolic defeat of Tenochtitlan, right? People in these pueblos had already come to understand themselves as Catholic. They already understood that they were Catholic since tiempo inmemorial, time immemorial, right? And so I'm focused especially on those communities, right, that were understanding themselves on those terms. So in the aftermath, they struggled against ruin, decline, and disrepair. They worried over orphaned children, over the paying of unjust tithes for the dead, and they were also concerned about the precarious state of their towns, their roads, and remarkably their churches, which is a significant preoccupation in the aftermath of this pandemic, this epidemic. So there were, one of the things that happens in Michoacan, and I'll gloss over this fairly quickly here, but that pueblos de Indios were advocating, and I think this is something that really someone needs to work on wholeheartedly, right? Because they're advocating to bring hospitals and their Spanish-style hospitals, you could say, and their accompanying technologies into their communities, right? Before and in the immediate aftermath of Cocolitzli. So the historian of medicine, Josefina Muriel in Mexico, identified, quote, countless petitions by indigenous towns requesting licenses to establish hospitals. And we have in reports from the time of this epidemic that there are towns that have like with 20 families or 30 families that have a hospital but no church, right? So sometimes that hospital is the first kind of Spanish institution that enters a community. But many of these hospitals, hundreds of them, 200 possibly, were founded on the insistence of indigenous petitioners, each with their own charter and each with their own mode of administration and governance. These are kind of community clinics that are constructed then by indigenous laborers, maintained by contributions, financial contributions, tithes from indigenous communities, and staffed in rotation by caretakers. So again, Bishop Medina Rincon, that Bishop of Michoacan, he writes about them in Pascua, and he writes there's a Hospital de Indios, and they say it provides good service. And the Indios maintain it out of devotion, and they give alms, and they travel throughout the province to ask for support, and grow corn and cotton for its maintenance. And these are sustained by the work of men and women who put their service at the needs of the hospital. And the hospital has its mayordomos and deputies that collect, manage, and spend the funds. He talks about them, and also the Archbishop of Mexico City writes in his report after the epidemic, when he does his sort of visita, he does his visitacion of his archdiocese, he says, well, the one thing I really wanted to see are these hospitales de indios, and I didn't get to see them because they say they're quite extraordinary. I think just suggesting an important line of future research. I want to talk about this other kind of response, indigenous, native, Mexican response, Catholic response after the Mortandad, which is what I term the Mixtec corpus mysticum, right? As the colony faltered, its economic, social, and religious fabric torn by the ravages of Mortandad, surviving Mesoamerican communities proclaimed a competing corporate and corporeal vision. They reasserted their presence, their persistence, and mapped their future. This sacred center of this revitalized religious landscape was the local church, built and maintained by their own labor under community administration and overseen not by Spanish clerics, but rather by the principales, local indigenous ruling elite. In this critical moment, I argue, pueblos de indios remade their ancestral territories as indigenous Catholic sovereign states that rivaled the jurisdiction of the diocese and the power of bishops, priests, and friars. And for me, this is a story that unfolds in the great numinous territorial maps painted in the years immediately following the Cocolitzli epidemic, the maps of the Relaciones Geográficas, or geographical reports. Of 76 extant maps in the collection, most were painted by indigenous artists with various degrees of autonomy from Spanish structures of control. These maps in my reading are key testimonies or windows into the worldview of surviving Mexican communities in the aftermath of the Mortandad, and I argue that they codify Christianity within indigenous Mexican historical, cultural, and cartographic traditions. And in this interpretation, I think this is maybe in my book the most unsettling of the interpretations, because these maps have traditionally been read as kind of nostalgic for a pre-invasion past, as kind of backward looking rather than forward, projecting forward into the future, which is my reading, that they're future oriented. So I center my interpretation here on the map of Teozacualco, which is the largest and among the very most well-known of these maps. It takes several staff at UT Austin's Benson Latin American collection to unfurl the great masterpiece from its roll. And I just heard this story on NPR that UT now has an endowment that rivals Harvard's because of the oil. So anyway, sidebar. But anyway, so they unfurl it, right? This large 23 discrete sheets of European paper. It occupies several library tables in the reading room. And painted in 1580, toward the end of the outbreak, it depicts the sacred territory of the Mixtec people of San Pedro Teozacualco, located in the modern-day state of Oaxaca. And I think when I saw that map unfurled, it was so clear to me that it was intended to astound the viewer, right? It's intended to kind of, it's quite powerful and impressive work. At the center of the large rectangular textile floats a blue-green cosmic orb. The circular body of the community and its surrounding geography appears as a pulsating heart, crisscrossed by a life-giving network of vein-like arteries, roads, paths, and waterways. Nestled within the many crossroads, 14 churches punctuate the landscape, bound together in hollowed relation. So this map for me represents that Mixtec corpus mysticum, right? That it is a vision of corporate Catholic belonging, but within the kind of parameters, right, of the traditional Altepetl, the traditional geography and cartography of pre-invasion Mexico. And so that's this final kind of argument that I have about these maps. And I'm happy to kind of wrap up there, and I can show you more images from the maps that kind of reiterate this point. But that's the kind of the theological provocation, right, is to read these in that vein. So with that, I'll wrap up and then open for questions.